Australia currently stands as one of the richest and most advanced countries on the globe, showcasing remarkably high levels of education, healthcare, and salaries, which, when combined with its relaxed and easygoing lifestyle, results in one of the highest living standards experienced anywhere worldwide. The quality of life in Australia is indeed so elevated that its 5 principal metropolitan regions, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide, consistently rank among the top 10 of the Global Livability Index, which evaluates cities based on their stability, healthcare, culture, environment, education, and infrastructure. All of this leads to Australia possessing one of the highest life expectancy rates globally, with males anticipated to live to an average of 81.3 years and females to roughly 85.4 years. However, Australia has not always experienced such high life expectancies, nor any other indicators of human development for that matter. Just over 150 years ago in 1870, a newborn was only expected to survive to the age of 34 on average. Furthermore, just a few decades before that, the livelihoods of many Australians consisted of little more than performing hard, strenuous labour in a brutal and unyielding environment. This is because for much of Australia's early history, the nation was administered as a penal colony for British convicts, who were transported to the distant side of the world to establish the foundations of the first European settlements there. But how did this nation transform to such an extent, shifting from a place where people were sent for punishment into a location where many wish to reside today? This is the story of Australia. All of our videos are accessible to view ad-free on our Substack page. You can also follow along with the original scripts, as well as listen to the audio narration in podcast format, by following the link in the video description below and subscribing with your email. Thank you. The continent and country known as Australia has been occupied for the majority of 65,000 years, with humans initially migrating there from Southeast Asia at the conclusion of the last ice age. These early adventurers were the first individuals to call Australia their home, eventually spreading out and establishing settlements across the vast landmass, extending from the Torres Strait Islands in the north to Tasmania in the south. These were the forebears of the modern Aboriginal peoples, who, over the ensuing millennia, formed the initial nations of Australia, comprising over 500 distinct tribal groups, each with their own languages and territories. Life in Aboriginal Australia would continue undisturbed similarly for countless generations. That was until a moment in the early 17th century that would alter the lives of the Indigenous peoples of Australia and their descendants forever: the arrival of Europeans. During the major age of discovery, which spanned from the late 15th to the 17th centuries, numerous Europeans embarked on ships to explore uncharted territories and develop trade routes to the exotic markets of Asia or the Americas. As the blank regions on the world maps began to be filled in, a hypothetical theory that had dated back to antiquity began to resurface among the more enlightened members of European society. It suggested that concerning the arrangement of the world's continents in the northern and southern hemispheres, the landmasses on each side would need to be balanced to maintain equilibrium globally. Thus, there should theoretically be a large continent located somewhere in the southern hemisphere that had yet to be found. This southern land, or Terra Australis, as it was referred to in Latin, was ultimately seen by European eyes in the early 1600s, when a Dutch ship under the command of William Janzoon achieved the first documented landing on the Australian coast in 1606. During this period, the Dutch were one of the leading exploratory nations that were mapping and discovering the world during the Age of Discovery. By the early decades of the 17th century, they had developed a vast maritime trading network that extended from Europe to South America, Africa, India, and the Far East. It was Asia in particular that captivated the attention of Dutch merchant explorers, who aimed to benefit from the lucrative spice trade centered on the islands that now form part of Indonesia. They subsequently established a private trading company to fund exploratory expeditions to these areas, with the Dutch East India Company, as it became known, employing navigators like William Janzoon to lead and direct the voyages toward the East Indies. In the following years, additional sightings of the Australian coastline were recorded and mapped by more Dutch explorers, such as Dirk Hartog, who anchored at Shark Bay in 1616, and Jan Carstens, who mapped sections of the southwestern corner of Australia in 1622. Other separate journeys resulted in the mapping of the northern and southern coastlines in the late 1620s. However, the most significant of these early expeditions was led by Abel Tasman in 1642, who reached Van Diemen's Land, later renamed Tasmania in honor of his discovery, as well as glimpsing New Zealand and Fiji. The Dutch discoveries of this new territory promptly led them to label it New Holland on their maps at that time. Nonetheless, the concept of dispatching Dutch colonists to such a remote and seemingly inhospitable area was never viewed as cost-effective by the Dutch East India Company, whose primary focus remained on the precious spice trade. Consequently, further explorations of Australia by Europeans ceased almost entirely for the next 100 years. It was only during Captain James Cook's voyages to the South Pacific in the 18th century that interest in Terra Australis was rekindled. Over the course of 3 separate expeditions between 1768 and 1779, Captain Cook conducted the most groundbreaking exploration of the Pacific Ocean ever undertaken by a European navigator. This included surveying not just Australia and New Zealand, but also other Pacific islands such as Hawaii, alongside Fiji. In April 1770, he first spotted the eastern coast of Australia and subsequently landed with a portion of his crew from the HMS Endeavour, christening the area Botany Bay due to the numerous natural specimens collected by the ship's botanist Joseph Banks. After spending 1 week investigating the surrounding region and attempting to engage with the local Aboriginals, Captain Cook raised anchor and sailed northward, exploring additional areas up the coast and claiming the entire region, which they dubbed New South Wales, for Britain. Upon his return home in 1771, Captain Cook conveyed the narratives of his findings to the government, as well as his assessment of the suitability of the region around Botany Bay for a potential British colonial settlement. Despite undertaking 2 more journeys to the Pacific over the following decade, Cook would never again set foot on Australian soil, as he was killed on the island of Hawaii in 1780 during his 3rd and final expedition. Captain Cook was, however, not the sole European navigator exploring the waters around Australia during this era. For in 1772, the French captain and privateer, Marc-Joseph Marion Dufresne, landed on Tasmania while mapping the South Seas. Additionally, that same year, fellow Frenchman Louis Aleno de Saint-Alouan formally claimed the western coastline of Australia in the name of France, overriding the Dutch assertions to New Holland from the previous century. Although both Britain and France officially declared the 2 sides of the continent to be part of their respective empires, any attempts to follow up on these claims with colonial settlements failed to materialize due to their distance from Europe and uncertainty regarding how such actions would be implemented. Ultimately, it would be events unfolding across the Atlantic Ocean in North America that would compel the British to send colonists to the territory of New South Wales. In 1775, the 13 colonies in America erupted in armed rebellion against British governance. In the resulting revolutionary conflict, which lasted for 8 years, the American rebels successfully cast off British authority and proclaimed their independence, founding the United States of America. With this, Britain lost some of the most valuable colonies in its empire, which posed not only a problem in itself, but also because for over the past century, Britain had effectively transported criminals convicted of minor offenses to the American colonies as a means of populating them. With this avenue no longer available, the British government began to devise plans to ship its convicts to Australia instead, and have them form the new colonies there to compensate for the loss of America. Consequently, the 11 ships of the First Fleet, carrying 1,400 individuals, departed Britain in May 1787, destined for Australia. They first arrived at Botany Bay in the following January of 1788, but quickly found the region unsuitable for settlement, despite the recommendations reported by Captain Cook years earlier. The captain of the First Fleet, Arthur Phillip, instead opted to sail further north to a different location, which had an excellent natural harbour. Upon arriving there, Phillip assumed the authority of governor of the new colony and named the site Sydney Cove, thus marking the inception of British settlement on the vast southern continent. Further convicts were transported aboard the Second and Third Fleets of 1790 and 1791 respectively, and upon their arrival in Sydney, constituted the core of the burgeoning colony. These convicts and their guards continued to make up the majority of New South Wales's populace in the early years. Although as time progressed, More and more of the original convicts were emancipated into free citizens after the terms of their penal sentences expired. The result of this was a growing free civilian population, which was also augmented by retired soldiers of the colony, alongside an increasing number of free settlers arriving from Britain each year. This rapid surge in population, however, introduced its own set of social issues. In March 1804, the first ever convict uprising erupted in the Castle Hill region of the settlement. It was swiftly quelled by the colonial authorities, though just 4 years later, the same regiment that suppressed the rebellion deposed the then colonial governor, William Bligh, in a coup d'etat. The Rum Rebellion of 1808, named after the illegal rum trade that the colony's soldiers engaged in, marked the first and only successful armed takeover of a government in Australian history. Following a short period of military governance, Lachlan Macquarie was appointed as the new governor of New South Wales and promptly began enhancing the colony's civil infrastructure. The successful establishment of Sydney as a colony convinced British authorities that Australia was indeed a viable and tenable option for augments of the empire. However, the success of Sydney also reached the ears of the French, who were exploring the continent for themselves around the same time the British were establishing their presence. The Comte de la Pérouse's expedition of 1788 and Nicolas Baudin's expedition of 1800 noted the British activities in Sydney and reported their findings to their superiors in Paris, which raised the possibility of France establishing a colony of its own in Australia. In response, Britain intensified its efforts to establish more colonies across the vast southern continent, both to secure its control over the region and simultaneously to curb any colonial aspirations from the French. Consequently, as the 19th century advanced, a new mix of both penal and free British settlements emerged throughout Australia, with Launceston and Hobart in Van Diemen's Land being established in the 1800s. The Moreton Bay Penal Settlement in what is currently Brisbane began in 1824. Perth and the Swan River Colony of Western Australia were founded in 1829. Melbourne, in what would later become the colony of Victoria, was established in 1835. And South Australia, centred on the city of Adelaide, was founded in 1836. All of this settlement by Europeans, however, swiftly impacted the native Aboriginal peoples of the region, whose land this was. Fully aware of the hardships they would encounter while attempting to establish colonies on the opposite side of the world, the British initially adopted a policy of cooperation and understanding with the Aboriginal Australians, so they could gain their trust and assist them in surviving in an unknown landscape. Nevertheless, despite the well-meaning intentions of the British, there was something being transported aboard their ships that would cause profound, irreparable damage to the relationship between them and the Aboriginal people of Australia for years to come. That something was illness. Due to the relative isolation of the Indigenous population over the past 60,000 years, they had little natural immunity to many of the illnesses carried by Europeans. An outbreak of smallpox in April 1789 claimed about half the Aboriginal population of the Sydney region, while only one death was reported among the British settlers. Further epidemics of not only smallpox but other illnesses like measles, influenza, typhoid, and tuberculosis persisted into the 19th century, leading to high mortality rates in Aboriginal communities. Alongside the outbreaks of disease, relations between the British and Aboriginal peoples were further strained by cultural misunderstandings, which frequently led to conflict. For instance, the Aboriginal people considered any animal, whether native or not, on their land as fair game to be hunted, while the British viewed this as poaching of their livestock. Moreover, the settlers, needing to communicate with the Aboriginal peoples, occasionally resorted to abducting men, women, and children from their local tribes, teaching them some basic English words, and having them serve as interpreters between the two communities. One of the first Aboriginal individuals taken in such a manner was Bennelong, who acted as a communicator between the local Eora people around Sydney and the newly arrived settlers. Another significant figure from the Aboriginal community during this time was Bungaree, who, although not kidnapped into service, voluntarily functioned as a liaison among the colonists and Aboriginal peoples. His services were so valuable that he was invited to join the expedition of Matthew Flinders in charting the Australian coastline in 1802, which subsequently made him the first Australian-born individual to circumnavigate the country. By the time Lachlan Macquarie took office as governor in Sydney, initiatives were being made to protect and accommodate the Aboriginal peoples within the growing British settlements. Schools and farms were established in an effort to integrate them into European lifestyles, and churches and missions were created to teach the tenets of Christianity. However, despite these measures, including the introduction of designated Aboriginal land reservations, much of the work done to encourage better relations between the two groups was often fruitless. The relentless expansion of British settlements onto Aboriginal territories quickly led to competition over resources, which in turn resulted in a series of conflicts known as the Frontier Wars. Lasting from the late 18th to the early 20th centuries, these violent encounters were often the result of the Aboriginal people's attempts to ward off the intruding settlers by attacking their farms, burning crops, stealing livestock, and killing some colonists. In retaliation, the European settlers would strike back, and amid this escalating cycle of violence, indiscriminate massacres occurred on both sides. Over the decades of the early 19th century, a growing number of settlers began migrating to the colonies and ventured further into the interior of the country in search of new opportunities. For the most part, these continued to mainly come from Britain and Ireland, with the practice of transporting convicts persisting well into the 1860s. However, the arrival of more and more free settlers, not just from Britain but from other parts of Europe such as Germany, Switzerland, and Italy, began to increase significantly by the mid-1840s, leading to calls for the establishment of local representative government and democratic reforms. This marked a substantial shift away from the autocratic governance of the colonial administrators and the emergence of the first state parliaments. One of the principal reasons European settlers opted to move to Australia was because of the vast areas of land available for acquisition, which could then be transformed into productive agriculture. The prospect of land ownership itself was enticing enough for many settlers, but what lay beneath the land would soon alter the fortunes of a lucky few. Gold. Although gold deposits had been discovered back in 1823, it was Edward Hargraves's find near Bathurst, New South Wales, in 1851 that led to the most significant gold rush in Australia's history. Within a decade of Hargraves's discovery, the population of Australia surged from 430,000 to 1,170,000 by 1861, as men from not only the adjacent colonies but from all corners of the globe, including Britain, America, and China, flocked to the goldfields of New South Wales and Victoria. The resulting mass influx of miners into the area quickly deplete the easily accessible gold supply, and for those who were not fortunate enough to strike it rich, the local taxes imposed by the heavy-handed administration only added to a growing list of grievances. What initially started as peaceful protests soon escalated into an open rebellion against colonial authority, culminating in the Battle of the Eureka Stockade in December 1854. Although the insurgent miners were defeated and promptly arrested for insurrection, they were later acquitted at trial, largely due to support from the Australian public, who empathized with their struggle for fair treatment and proper representation. It was here that egalitarianism, especially before the law, became one of the fundamental principles of Australian societal values. The gold rush of the 1850s was succeeded by a broader economic boom in the latter half of the 19th century. With this came the expansion of housing, consumer goods and services, as well as urban development manifested in more towns and cities, connected by a continually expanding rail network. However, not all segments of Australian society benefited from the opportunities present during these times, as the rural poor were increasingly marginalised. With no alternative means of sustaining themselves, some turned to acquiring wealth through illicit activities and became bushrangers, essentially Australia's version of the American Wild West outlaws of the same era. The bushrangers roamed the country districts, committing acts of robbery against anyone or anything that crossed their path, whether it be a stagecoach, a local farm, or even a town bank. The exploits of these criminals quickly earned them a romanticized reputation as local folk heroes, but in some instances, such as that of Ned Kelly, they became infamous, with their stories enshrined in national legend. The boom years for Australia would reach a conclusion by the 1890s, as the nation entered a period of economic downturn, characterized by rising unemployment, labor strikes, and the emergence of trade unions. The challenges encountered during this time fostered the growth of a distinct Australian national identity, one that still retained connections to the mother country of Britain, but also looked ahead to self-determination independent of colonial governance. With the dawn of the 20th century, the 6 distinct colonies of Australia, motivated by the burgeoning national sentiment, concerted their efforts to push for a mandate of federalisation from the imperial government in London. Following thorough negotiations, a bill was enacted by Parliament in July 1900, and the Commonwealth of Australia was subsequently proclaimed by the Governor-General, Lord Hopetoun, on January 1, 1901, with Sir Edmund Barton being inaugurated as the nation's first Prime Minister. One of the first significant pieces of legislation introduced by the new nation was the White Australia policy, which prohibited anyone of non-European descent, particularly Asians, from entering the country. This was enacted to preserve the primarily British composition of Australia's populace, which contemporaries argued would assist in uniting the emergent nation into a singular cultural and socio-economic entity. In reality, it was merely an apartheid-like system, designed to restrict other ethnicities from seizing opportunities from white Australians. The early history of Australia had been shaped primarily by its direct relationship with the colonial mother country of Britain. However, as the second decade of the 20th century arrived, the nascent nation would find itself irrevocably transformed by the outbreak of the First World War. Although the majority of the conflict occurred on the front lines of Europe, the war for many Australian soldiers would be defined by their experiences in the Middle East, serving alongside their comrades from the New Zealand Corps of Troops that became known as the Anzacs. In the Gallipoli Campaign of 1915, forces from Australia, New Zealand, alongside Britain, France and India, faced devastating casualties while striving to capture the Dardanelles Strait from a determined Ottoman Turkish army. Although the campaign concluded in defeat for the Allies, it represented a pivotal moment in the national consciousness of Australia, as its soldiers earned a reputation for remarkable bravery and selfless sacrifice in the face of adversity. In the later stages of the war, Australian regiments were deployed to the Western Front, as well as continuing their engagement in the Middle East, where they displayed similar levels of courage and resolve. By the war's end in 1918, approximately 324,000 Australians had served overseas, with 60,000 fatalities and 150,000 wounded, the highest casualty rate of any Allied force during the conflict. The ensuing interwar years brought mixed fortunes for Australia. Although it was granted Dominion status from Britain under the Statute of Westminster in 1931, it fell into an economic depression during the early 1930s. Despite the austerity of this period, some of the most iconic Australian cultural achievements and legacies emerged. For instance, the Queensland and Northern Territory Aerial Service, eventually becoming the airline and national flag carrier known as Qantas, was established in 1920. The pilot Sir Charles Kingsford Smith completed the first aerial circumnavigation of Australia in 1927, later accomplishing the first ever trans-Pacific flight from Oakland, California to Brisbane, Queensland the following year. Further legacies, particularly in sports, were established, with figures like Don Bradman setting all-time records on the cricket pitch, and the racehorse Phar Lap achieving championship victories at the Melbourne Cup, Australian Derby, and other competitions. While seemingly trivial, these records and victories offered many Australians moments of joy and pride during otherwise bleak times. By 1939, Australia's economic position had improved, but its geographical situation in the wider Indo-Pacific region soon drew it into contention with the expanding ambitions of the Empire of Japan. As in the previous World War, Australia once again answered the call to arms from the mother country, with its troops being deployed globally to defend the British Empire, from the cities of Europe to the deserts of North Africa, and the jungles of Burma to the Pacific Islands. Unlike in the prior conflict, however, Australia faced several attacks on its own territory, with the Japanese Air Force launching bombing raids on cities like Darwin, as well as other communities such as Broome and Townsville. Additionally, both the Japanese and German navies engaged in submarine warfare in Australian waters, sinking numerous merchant and military vessels, and even executing a raid on Sydney Harbour in June 1942. As the war drew to a close in 1945, Australia began realigning its geopolitical priorities, realizing it could no longer rely solely on protection from its colonial overlord situated on the other side of the globe. The United States' entry into the war and their collaborative operations in the Pacific Theatre, alongside Australian forces, resulted in a shift in diplomatic strategy toward alignment with views in Washington rather than London. The post-war years ushered in another economic boom that helped shape Australia into the nation it is today. War-ravaged areas worldwide, especially in Europe, saw thousands of immigrants move to Australia throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s, seeking to forge a better life for themselves. Such was the scale of migration beyond the usual British diaspora that the White Australia policy became outdated in the face of economic and political realities. The influx of these newcomers further bolstered Australia's economy, as they filled roles in expanding manufacturing industries and undertook construction of much-needed housing and civil infrastructure projects. For much of the latter half of the 20th century, Australia transformed itself into a prime destination for individuals looking to create a new and improved life. Its relative isolation compared to the rest of the world shielded it from many broader geopolitical issues of the era, such as the Cold War. Nevertheless, its closer ties with the USA led to involvement in the Vietnam War during the 60s and 70s. Additionally, this shift in foreign policy sparked discussions regarding the nation's own domestic issues, specifically addressing the historical treatment of the Indigenous Aboriginal peoples. The acknowledgement and reconciliation process for Indigenous affairs became a crucial focus in these years, with efforts directed toward addressing past injustices and recognizing the enduring plight of Aboriginal peoples. This move toward modernity and evolving attitudes is perhaps best exemplified by the opening of iconic cultural landmarks, such as the Sydney Opera House in 1973 and the hosting of the Olympic Games in 2000, which showcased the beauty of the harbour city and the nation as a whole to the international community. Today, Australia stands as a testament to its capacity to adapt and flourish even in the face of formidable challenges, reflecting a legacy of the early settlers who arrived on its shores with little but ultimately created a vibrant and prosperous nation.